you have used family albums and Felix Morin's studio portraiture as material for your work. So I was just wondering where you stand in terms of your relationship with archives.
In growing up, nobody in my family took photos. There was never a sense of documenting. We didn't own a camera. We had we would go to a studio once in a while to take a photograph or to have a photograph rendered. And then when I started looking at my family history and indenture history, I wanted those photographs. I wanted to find those photographs, and there aren't any. There are very, very few photographs that are around in my family at all. And then I started thinking more about just the idea of archives, and the fact that I didn't have any. I didn't really have any to access. I had very, very few. And for me to go in search of a history, I needed to find a way to do that. And so I was consistently doing searches on the internet. When I was back in Trinidad in 2018, I did visit the National Archives there, looking for information on my maternal grandparents. I wanted to know which boat they came in on, when did they come in, what are their names, because the names that we were given, I wanted to make sure that they were the same that was actually recorded in the book. And I didn't find anything. I actually ended up having to hire a genealogist who, he has helped many people trace their roots back to India. And so he was able to find copies of my maternal grandparents' immigration passes. The idea for the project was after I took a DNA test, where I was like, it comes back 100% South Asian. And I'm thinking to myself, like who's ever 100% of anything, and I had them redo the test and it came back 100% South Asian twice. And so I'm thinking, it made me happy because it's like being denied being Indian for so long, having a DNA test telling me I'm 100% South Asian, now going into the archives and finding, my grandparents, that yes, there's absolute proof that I came from India. I could retrace some of my family history, so I started feeling better about the lack of photographs from my immediate family. And then I went in search of other photographs. I started looking at, okay, who are these indentured laborers? Where did they come from? How many were sent over? And then I just kind of bumped into Felix Morin's work. I was thinking, well, how? Because women back then didn't have these opportunities. Like, who was taking this? Who was actually taking the images? Come to find out, it was a French colonial, because Indian women didn't have a lot of lateral movement in general, although they had more freedom being in the Caribbean than they did in India. So I started, just like questioning all of that. Who are they? Under what circumstances were they there? Were they compensated? Was it voluntary? Because, women coming over on boats, the stories that I've read and things that I've heard, it wasn't all voluntary, right? Some people were kidnapped, coaxed, lied to, obviously terribly lied to about their working conditions and so on, but also people wanted to flee whatever circumstances they were under. And because there were only a quarter of them were actual women, there was a lot of stuff that happened on the ships. There was violence, there were rapes, there were lots of things that happened to these women. And so it made me really uncomfortable to find them. And I started reading more and read that they were called coolie bells, and that these images were used as sort of a marketing tool, for European tourists, because they wanted the European tourists to come and tour the islands. Because, when they're really small, you can't really see details. So I had them printed larger, and I started looking at the images closer and realized they're all so similarly dressed. And who walks around on a plantation looking like this. You know, all this jewelry. Now, in women, yes, Indian women wear their wealth. We know that, and we knew that. You know, banks would not deal with the Indian people there, right? So they had to wear their wealth. They would definitely didn't seem like victims to me. It seems like there was a mix of they wanted perhaps to be photographed because maybe there was a sense of pride or something going on, and also what was their participation in their portraiture, right? Did they bring that jewelry with them? Did they borrow the jewelry? Did they want to be photographed the way they saw themselves? Or did he dress them to brand them as the exotic, right? As othering? It seems like they were posed. And being a photographer, you know, I know what I do in my studio, right? To get that picture that I want. I will manipulate. So I'm thinking that he did something similar. So for me, it's not that I was rescuing these women. I don't think these women need rescuing, but it was a way to sort of take his hand away from them.
Yeah.
This white guy who took pictures of these Indian women in these sort of like suggestive kind of ways, right? With, you know, some of them had exposed arms, exposed. And I'm thinking, I don't know, that there's something not respectful in a way of how these were done. And I just put aside, you know, my family archives for a minute, and I started looking at them and thinking about them and kind of talking to them. You know, I would have conversations with the canvases in my studio. And I realized, you know, they could very well be my family. Like I'm in search of something, I don't even know what I'm in search of because there are no documents to prove otherwise. And I find these. And so I started looking at it more as the archives of my own family. You know, even though I couldn't find anything in my immediate, it was almost like a proxy for my family. And I fell in love with them. I fell in love, you know, with whatever their stories could be, because my maternal grandmother was by herself. She lived in an area, I think, called Balia in UP, right? And I think about her journey, like what her journey could have been as a 20-year-old woman. What did she have to go through? Like the strength it took to do that. I mean, she may not have been totally by herself. I'm thinking, but as a woman, she didn't, I don't think she wasn't married, as far as I know. I mean, there's story that she was married, but she was widowed. But we don't know. We don't know if any of that is true. There's another story that says that she met my grandfather on the boat and they were married. There's another there's another story that she was married, widowed, and that my grandfather was her dead husband's brother. You know, when they left, they never went back because a lot of times some Indians, right, they chose to stay. Others, you know, the British had lied and said, okay, we'll give you a passage back. And we know, well, that's not true. They never went back to their family. So it's possible that I have family there. I know I have family somewhere, you know, but they were fleeing, right? The Indians were fleeing. They wanted to find a better life. They wanted to make money. There was famine going on in India at the time, caused by the British. So what were their choices? I knew my grandfather for a few years before he passed away. But nobody ever talked about this. This was never, ever part of the conversation growing up. And my name is also a big mystery, you know, like my name is Renluka growing up, which is an Indian name, right? People know, named after, it's a goddess name, right? And when I was 9 years old and I came to the States, My birth paper had a different name. My name on my birth paper was Renluka. And so everything changed. My green card now said Renluka. My passport said Renluka. Everything matched my birth paper. So I was Renluka. And it's not like, I mean, at 9 years old, you're not thinking, oh, I have this new identity. But in hindsight, it's like, whoa, wait a second. I'm coming to a new country with a new name. It's like, what does that mean? And then I think of Maharaj, and Maharaj is not a real name, right? It's more of like a title.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a lot of Maharaj in Trinidad, nowhere else. Like if you go to all the different colonies that the Indians were sent to, you don't meet a lot of Maharaj, but there's a ton of them in Trinidad. Maharaj had to have been on my father's side, because when my maternal grandparents came over, their last name was Singh. Even though we've always identified as Brahmin, really, really exciting because it gives me a lot more, I guess, fodder, to choose from for my work, for everything else. And adds like another piece to the puzzle of this search for myself and at large my family, and then other people like me and within the Indo-Caribbean community who may or may not have a curiosity or who can access the things that I'm able to access and have platforms to talk about these things. But I do wish to come back to India, and I do wish to go to Calcutta, where the ships left from. I was told that there are books there that I can access. I want to trace my roots back and go to UP and find family if I could. So the archives is just this sort of jumping off point for me to find my family.
And through color, you have made a lot of interventions, both formal and conceptual, in how you approach or kind of rescript the colonial history of studio portraiture. So I was just wondering if you could walk us through your process.
The more I think of color and how color is used in art and in Western art, there's very, very few artists that use color boldly. I feel like there's a lot of this shyness around color or fear around color because the Western aesthetic doesn't appreciate it, but I grew up very, very Hindu. My mom was very devout. I followed my mother around from temple to temple. And I fell in love with the gods and the goddesses and in how they were rendered, and how my mom would use color to worship. And there was color in everything that was done, from how the temples were decorated or how our homes were decorated, and flowers everywhere. And just, there was no fear because color was supposed to be joy. I know that's where my love of color comes from. And growing up in a tropical country as well, where there's just color everywhere. You can't escape it. When I started studying photography, it was black and white, of course, right? And there was this love of black and white. And there continues to be a love of black and white photography to the point where it's fetishized. I never had an appreciation for it because I kind of figured, people were shooting black and white then because that was what was available. If there was color photography, they would be shooting color, and it's like when the Indians got a hold of photographs, they colored them, right? There's a long history in India of colorizing photos. So color for me it's not like it's anti-Western, but I try to think of it like that in my work, that it's my way of celebrating my culture and something outside of the Western world, and sort of being in opposition to what they expect you to do as an artist. When I look at these archival photographs, all I want to do is add color to them, to sort of bring them to life, to give them I don't know, to sort of like take them out of that grayness, out of that gray world where there's no, it's almost like being in limbo when there's a lack of color. So yeah, I think that's what color is for me.